I'd have you make out your checks to my defense committee, but I'll be out of jail before you can write the check out. So. We had a meeting earlier today speaking to a media group on the question of, is the media biased? And particularly with particular reference to the Middle East. And what I would like to do here today is to discuss the character of our enemy, who it is, where it comes from, and what's the solution to this problem. The agreement that is in the works between the government of Israel, particularly the foreign minister Perez, and Yasser Arafat, is essentially based on the idea that there should be economic development in that area. That is, that there needs to be strong construction of canals and power plants and railroads to build up industry and work in that region for the mutual benefit of all the people in that area. That's the basis, the real basis for these accords. And this, I'm not being chauvinistic when I say that this way of approaching a problem, such a terrible division, is a typically American way to approach a problem like that. And it's typically American, particularly if you go back a little bit in American history. And it's typically American, especially if you contrast it to what has been typically British, or the British Empire approach, which involves the division of people on the basis of race and nationality, the creation of wars in order to continue to maintain power. Now, it's difficult in our time of ignorance, in our time of acceptance of ignorance as being some sort of natural thing. People don't know any history. They don't feel they need to know any history. They don't know any science. They don't feel they need to know any science. This is a catastrophe, this ignorance in our country. It's difficult under these circumstances to bring up things, even if they're very important, and even talk about them. Like, for example, Britain. How are you going to talk about Britain in Southern California? Right? That's a problem, right? Even if you know that it's true and necessary that you talk about that. Really, I think that the most courageous thing that we have to do is to put on the agenda before people for discussion certain kinds of topics that are not on the agenda now, where the media defines the agenda for what's going to be discussed. It's not so much their slant on things. That's not even the problem. Most of the time, they're not discussing an area of a problem at all. It's just not, they don't report the news at all concerning this, let alone the history, the background, or any reasonable approach to it. So here you have this problem. In the Middle East, on February 25th, one or more people went into a holy shrine of the Jewish people, which was also a holy shrine of the Muslims, and systematically assassinated as many people as possible with automatic weapons fire while they were praying. That's what just happened. Hundreds of people were shot. How many died, I don't recall, but hundreds were shot. The killers in this atrocity were, of course, trying to break up the peace accords and destabilize the region. They were trying to rescue a certain type of British approach to things and subvert an alternative approach that could be of great value to the world. Now, what we need to do is to understand who did that and what are they. If I say that this is the British doing that, you have to understand what that means. That's not just, I mean, it's not some sort of indirect thing that we're talking about here. It's not a slander or just a characterization. In a sense, this is similar to, we published a book called Dope Incorporated. And that book took up the question of whatever happened. We're trying to understand the dope problem in America when we wrote that book, when EIR did that book. And so we studied the question, whatever happened to the old British Empire opium trade of the 19th century, when they openly went over and made wars to force countries like China to have opium? Whatever happened to those forms of business, to the shipping companies that did that and so forth? How did they leave that business and get into some other type of more legitimate business? And the answer was pretty shocking. The answer was they never did leave it, and they're still doing it. They just changed certain formats. They set up banks in different parts of the world over, but they still continue to do exactly the same business. Certain new areas were opened up, cocaine and so forth. The same thing applies in this area, that you have a long-standing British involvement in the Middle East, which people know something about, and I'm going to get into that tonight, which never stopped, even though the British Empire doesn't seem to be a big deal in the world, right? What's the British Empire, after all? Nothing, right? Went out of existence, more or less. Now, really, what's the International Monetary Fund? What are international bankers? What is the international media? I'm going to make a simple proposition on the killers at Hebron. There are two ways that you have to understand them. Number one, they are representatives of a British party. It's essentially British. And number two, they're gangsters. Now, by gangsters, I mean people who run dope, gun running, prostitution, robberies, murder, etc. And there's a political organization of this party within the Jewish community that includes people in very fancy suits. They go by the name of the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith. And then there's people who wear the clothing of an FBI provocateur, like Meir Kahane, who organized terrorist parties in Brooklyn, and they're still sending guns and people over to Israel to blow the place up. But this is a single party. Now, this is of immense importance to us in many different ways. I'm going to write a word on the board here. There's a company called the Hollinger Corporation, which is a sort of board of directors, in a certain sense, for this party that I'm talking about. The Hollinger Corporation is a newspaper publishing company that owns many different newspapers and probably other types of media, but it's the newspapers that we're primarily concerned about here. This company owns the Jerusalem Post, which is the main English language newspaper of Israel. And that in Israel, the Jerusalem Post is the mouthpiece for the violent, terrorist, anti-Arab faction. Ariel Sharon, the former general, the enormously fat general. He speaks through the Jerusalem Post. It didn't used to be like that. It was more of a liberal media. Now they call it right-wing. But you're missing the point a little bit unless you see the Hollinger Corporation owns it. They also own the Telegraph in London, the Daily Telegraph. They also own the Chicago Sun-Times. They also own the Financial Post of Canada, like the Wall Street Journal of Canada, and they own about 80 other newspapers in the United States. This is actually a British and Canadian news company. Now here's the board of some of the people on the board of directors. Peter Bronfman, who owns the real estate, who manages the real estate operations for the Bronfman family of Canada. Margaret Thatcher, Lord Carrington, and his partner, Henry Kissinger, from Kissinger Associates. David Brinkley, Lord Rothschild, William F. Buckley Jr., whose brother turned down our appeal, and so we have to go to, he's a judge in Washington. Paul Volcker, and Lord Wiedenfeld, who is the head of the Institute for Jewish Affairs in London, which is an Anti-Defamation League front operation over there. The London Daily Telegraph is the original source, and this corporation is the original source of the Whitewater affair. That is, these people from England and their representatives in Washington began to publish violent attacks on President Clinton at a certain point when he began to question certain British Empire approaches to things, particularly what was going on in Russia. He said maybe it's not so great that the IMF is saying that Russia should be stripped bare and people should starve and they should deliver all their worldly goods up to international financiers and gangsters. Maybe that won't work. He just questioned it a little bit. And remember, the chronology is very important, because what Clinton did around the same time as he and Gore both questioned this international liberal establishment program. Pretty wild, right? For Gore to question that? The world is interesting today, right? But Clinton first made that question. So he appointed Bobby Inman to be Secretary of Defense, who also questions some of these things, and Strobe Talbot to be Deputy Secretary of State. And Strobe Talbot had said just before that, he was a special ambassador to Russia. He had said, maybe we need a little bit less shock and a little more therapy. They were talking about the so-called shock therapy that this crowd has been hitting Russia with. If you keep backing Russia into a corner by saying you should be poor and starve, that welcome to capitalism, all you're going to do is turn them into an enemy, and they've got H-bombs. You want a World War III, that's a good way to get it. Maybe that's not a good plan. He said maybe that's not a good plan. So all of a sudden, both Strobe Talbot and Bobby Inman were accused of what? Being anti-Israel. Didn't have anything to do with what they were talking about. It's not true either. But you get a sense, you begin to get a sense of the party that we're talking about. Now, when I say that we're talking about gangsters, this is not just using that word in some loose fashion. We're talking about, for example, Meyer Lansky. Who is Meyer Lansky? He's dead now, but who was he? He was considered the kingpin of he was the lead financier and organizer for organized crime in the United States. He was born in Poland, and there's a book out. In fact, I have this book right here. Did I bring it with me? There it is. Here. Meyer Lansky. It's written by 3 Israelis. One of them is Yuri Dan. These people, the authors are Israeli journalists who are spokesmen for this party. they're mouthpieces for Ariel Sharon and the violent, extreme, racist, anti-Arab faction in Israel. And what they say in this book, which is entirely favorable to Meyer Lansky, is that Lansky heard from his parents in Poland about anti-Jewish attacks that were going on all the time and learned that Jews should fight back against these attacks. So that therefore, because of these attacks, whatever somebody like Lansky does is really morally justified. And obviously they're using this to relate to what they're doing, but that's not the only thing. Because you begin to find out that they are closely related to Meyer Lansky in their activities. And you see little incidents. If you don't know anything more than is in this book, you might not quite figure it out. But for example, when Ariel Sharon invaded Egypt in the 1967 war, Meyer Lansky's organization sent him a basket of champagne and cigars in Egypt. Meyer Lansky's organization. And that's in the book. What's that all about? Isn't that weird? A general in a war? And he was criticized for doing that, too. He had champagne and caviar and cigars from the Meyer Lansky organization in the middle of his war. How is that related to what we have to deal with in politics? Well, it goes back, again, to this problem that you have, that the most important things that you have to discuss with people are things that they don't even think are relevant to anything. I'll give you an example. Any of you go to the movies, ever? Any of you ever watch television? If you consider the fact that Hollywood was set up and has been run by killers, by satanic killers, that is, people who murder again and again and again and again. They also set up Las Vegas as a coordinated operation. That after World War II, the British Special Operations Executive, that is the secret intelligence service of the British operating out of Canada and England, set up operations for the Lansky mob to launder drug money, to run things in the Caribbean, and to run gambling operations all over the country. And these people directly set up Las Vegas completely. They set up all the lottery operations in the country. And now this is taken on a professional look to it, with professional corporations involved, supposedly not related to these people. But this is the future of the United States. We're going to be doing nothing but gambling and entertainment. Gambling, entertainment, sex perversion, and sports. 25 hours a day and no other industry. You don't have to do any other industry. The schools will train people to be workers in those industries, right? If this party predominates. The bootlegging, right? The gangsters, the American organized crime is entirely British. In the 1920s, under Prohibition, you have three principal figures setting that up on this end. One of them is Meyer Lansky, who's running operations with his underling, Lucky Luciano, and Al Capone and various people in different parts of the country, especially as you got towards about 1930, completely dominating that. Then you have the Bronfman family in Canada, and a guy named Arnold Rothstein, who's in high society and goes over to England, and all of those parts of it coordinate with the lords of England. Like General Haig, the head British general in World War I. His family runs Haig Scotch, and he's a partner with Bronfman, a direct partner, not a hidden partner. They are a company, 50-50, right? And the gangsters ran all of this under the complete control of Great Britain. Murder, hijacking, arson, constant murders. The amount of murders that were involved in setting up these different things. First, the so-called, bootlegging. But then you get into the post-bootlegging operations with these same channels of dope, smuggling, and gambling, and entertainment. All by the same group. And imagine if you say, let's legalize narcotics, that'll solve the problem. Well, how much are you going to legalize? You're going to legalize murder, legalize every element of this whole thing. That's not the solution to it. Now, where does this come from? What's the background of this arrangement? You can begin to get the smell of this if you're courageous enough, if you go into your own neighborhood and talk to probably even some of your own friends and ask them about the end times. End times, right? Oh, there's going to be a war in the Middle East. It says so in the Bible. Whoa, God says that the Jews are going to go back to Palestine. They're going to have a war with the Arabs, and that will bring on the end of the world. That's good, because God prophesies that in the Bible, and that's God's will. That's true if God is the same thing as Lord Palmerston. So that if you see somebody believing that, or telling you that they read about that in the Bible, you have to know enough and be self-confident enough to try to get that person either some sympathetic attention from a professional person, which is yourself, or else at least don't try to get involved in a crazy conversation with them, because they're reciting British propaganda. Geopolitics, that's what's called geopolitics. In other words, the religion that's gotten into American Protestants, heavily in the black community, heavily among Baptists, and of course, it's a certain heart idea of Zionism, right? Is British geopolitics. First one who proposed that the Jews need to go back to Palestine was Lord Palmerston, the British foreign minister and later prime minister. In 1840, he sent a letter to the British ambassador in Turkey. Palestine at that time was part of the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire. And Lord Palmerston said, the Jews as a nation desire to return to Palestine. And of course, as Alba Ibn pointed out, the Jews didn't know anything about that at the time. The British then sent troops a month later for the first time and landed them in Palestine. They didn't take it over at that time, but they started to, get involved. Now, after the Civil War, the British set up a very strange organization called the Palestine Exploration Fund. It was set up by Queen Victoria and by the United Grand Lodge of Masons and other people supporting Masonic ideas. What do? They went to Palestine, which didn't belong to Britain. It was part of the Turkish Empire. And they started to dig in the city of Jerusalem. Dig for ancient temples. Dig for any ruins that might be put to a certain use by the British Empire. The Masons talk about restoring the Temple of Solomon, and this is what Meir Kahane and some of these crackpots of the extreme wing in Israel talk about. We got to restore the Temple of Solomon. And then your so-called fundamentalists over here will say, yes, once that's restored, then we can have our end of the world. Right? End times. Oh boy. Why do they want to restore Solomon's temple? That wasn't the last temple. There were 3 temples. The last time it got closed down was the 3rd temple, not Solomon's. Solomon's was the 2nd. Why do they want to restore Solomon's temple? Because I think it might have to do with the fact that Solomon had more than God in his temple. He also had a few pagan gods in there, right? read about that. Whatever it is, these guys from Britain went over there in the 1860s, 1870s, and dug way down. The leader of this, the head of the Palestine Exploration Fund, was a man named Sir Charles Warren, who wrote a book about his experience as the lead. He was an engineer in Her Majesty's Army. He wrote a book called Underground Jerusalem. Another book called The Temple or the Tomb. And he published a book in the 1870s about proposing the colonization of that section of the Ottoman Empire that the British called Palestine, in exchange for taking over Turkey's national debt, right? And he said, let this be done with the avowed intention of gradually introducing the Jew, pure and simple, who is eventually to occupy and govern this country. It is written over and over again in the Word of God. Israel are to return to their own land. It's a British Army guy saying this, right? Okay, so now, who is this fellow? This is Charles Warren. He goes back to England. He takes a few trips to South Africa, spends a number of years killing the natives down there and shooting some of the Dutch people. And then he goes back in 1886 to London, and he starts a new Masonic organization, and it's called the Quatuor Coronati Lodge. We still have this here. Let's write this down for you specialists in the audience. Quatuor Coronati means the four crowned ones. This is a research lodge of the Freemasons, the British Freemasons. By the way, when I say Freemason, I mean British Freemasons, because as of this point in time in the world today, there's nothing but British Freemasonry. There's Prince Hall Black Freemasonry in America, which is very quiet and is intimidated by these other guys. But among white people on the whole planet, with a minor exception in France, don't say Freemasonry, say British Freemasonry, okay? It's British. Anyway, this is a special lodge they set up. This guy was the head of it. He had another job at the same time. He was police commissioner in London. And it just happened at that time that the royal family had a little problem. The grandson of the Queen married the wrong person, see? And they wanted to cover that up, and she was hustled off to an insane asylum, and all the witnesses were killed. Cut up with Masonic signs all over them. And they said, oh, it's a lone assassin named Jack the Ripper. And it was nice to have a police commissioner who's also the head of this lodge, Quatuor Coronati. Also, they had the assistant coroner who's in the same little group. And he lost his job because there was a big uproar about that, but so what? He helped the royal family out, you know. This lodge went on to do very interesting things. They produced some new groups in the world. You've heard about some of these groups. One group that they controlled was called the Theosophists. Another group that they controlled was called astrology. Astrology had been ended in Europe, possibly hundreds of years before. There was some little bits of astrology that would float through France, etc., but at least for 100 years, or much more than that, it was dead in France and Germany. And in the 1890s, the British reintroduced it into Germany and France. Why would they do that? Geopolitics. And these guys write about how they did it and how proud they are of introducing superstition into Europe. There was a group called the Order, capital O, Order of the Golden Dawn, that was organized by this little group in England, this research lodge, and who are the founders and promoters of Zionism also, right, in the sense of having actually undertaken this as a project. This group was later run by Aleister Crowley, He's a pretty famous Satanist who came to Hollywood and helped start Hollywood early in this century. There was another, these guys were running Freemasonic and various occultist things in Turkey to shake things up in Turkey and prepare the way for the Messiah? I doubt it. All right? Prepare the way for British geopolitical games and to control the route to India and so forth, right? It's a very strategic area, Israel, right? Palestine, right between Europe, Asia, and Africa. So they had in Turkey all of these crazy false Muslim groups based on the Sufi tradition, run by the British. The B'nai B'rith was there in great depth, run by the British. There was a guy who went down there to Turkey from Germany and became involved with these British organizations, became a Turkish Freemason there and astrologer named Sabatendorf. I don't know if I spelled it correctly, but he became famous later. He went back to Germany and founded another sub-order of this thing called the Tula Society, which is the people who taught Adolf Hitler about the occult. All run by the British. Houston Stewart Chamberlain was there living in southern Germany and promoting, he married Wagner's daughter and was promoting Nazism for the British. All right, so this is what they were doing. Now, the chief Zionist in the period right after this, before you actually got somebody doing something about Zionism, was a man named Lawrence Oliphant. A very strange man who was in and out of America as a spy for the British. And he wrote a letter to the Foreign Secretary of England. Now this will get you right to your neighbor's problem. The end times. This is what he said. He said that he's a spy. He's a professional spy. His uncle is head of the East India Company. He's a personal spy for Lord Palmerston and then for other British governments. He came here and helped the Confederacy to try to break up the United States. He was all over the world doing these various revolutions and stuff. So he wrote to the Foreign Minister of England. He said that we have to set up a Palestine Development Company as the precursor for a Jewish state. This guy's not Jewish, right? He's a British aristocrat. He says most of the immigrants will probably consist of oppressed Jews from Romania and the south of Russia. He's writing this in 1878. He says, financing of this will be easy. Quote, any amount of money can be raised upon it, owing to the belief which people have that they would be fulfilling prophecy and bringing on the end of the world. I don't know why they are so anxious for the latter event, but it makes the commercial speculation easy, as it is a combination of the financial and sentimental elements which will, I think, ensure success. And you thought that was your religion or your neighbor's religion. You didn't realize that it was this cheap operation by a bunch of British lunatics, right? Who say God said it. Isn't that amazing? Because they attribute a mass murder plan to God. And people buy it all over the place. Okay, now, this, oh, by the way, this guy actually eventually moved to Palestine when he left a cult in upstate New York. He moved to Palestine, wrote books on why men and women should not have sexual relations, and eventually died of syphilis in Palestine. Lawrence Oliphant, a very famous man in the 19th century. Yes, sir.
I have a question. So, would I be safe to say that the British also controlled the activities of the Crusaders fighting against the Muslims during the...
No. You don't try to take the British back that far. The British problem only starts as we're talking about it now, around 1500, 1600. Because before that, there were other people. Like the British didn't start the slave trade or anything like that. England was a fine country in times past, and it got corrupted. But let's save that for later, okay? You can finish up this introduction to the problem with the character of Lord Balfour, B-A-L-F-O-U-R, who was British Prime Minister at the beginning of this century, at the same time as Teddy Roosevelt was president and Edward VII was the king. And he was a completely insane person. He believed in the end times. He believed that the universe would eventually consume the Earth, or the sun would blow up and consume the Earth in 1 billion years. But that's still going to happen, and therefore everything man does is of no value whatsoever. The universe simply yawns at man. Very strange viewpoint for a human being to have. He proposed that Jews should not come to England. He told this to the Parliament, that what they need to do is go over to Palestine because we have some use for them over there. He didn't like Jews. And then later on, when he was foreign minister in 1917, he was the one who made the famous declaration, the Balfour Declaration, saying the British Empire will look favorably on having Palestine as a homeland for the Jews. He was also the head of the Psychical Research Society. And it was the president of that in England and ran many Americans who were in that, like William James, the so-called father of psychology. Many of these people are wildly insane and are therefore qualified to be psychologists. Now, what is this party that we're talking about? Does this affect this in other than these types of areas? Let me bring up some California problems. In 1974, 5, 6, I forget what year, there was a young student at Stanford University. He was 19 years old. He was from North Dakota. His name was Bruce Perry. And he had a lovely young wife, 19 years old, also from North Dakota. She's also a student at Stanford, and they were living in student housing for married couples. And one night, his wife was brutally murdered in the church at Stanford University, in the college chapel. It was a satanic ritual killing, and I'm not going to describe the details. It's very gruesome and disgusting. And the body was arranged in a ritual fashion and so forth. Everybody was totally shocked. The police went to this guy's house or apartment to inform him about the murder. He comes to the door and he's covered with blood. He said it was a nosebleed. And when they tested the blood, supposedly it was not his wife's blood type. The murder was never solved. This Bruce Perry went on to become a famous psychiatrist. He is the head of the Baylor University Medical Psychiatric Operations in Texas. He is a national spokesman for the theory that there is no such thing as satanic ritual crimes. Now, this is extremely perturbing, not only because of what happened to him, but because the murder of his wife became perhaps the most famous satanic crime in American history, because it was the opening scene in a book called The Ultimate Evil, written by Maury Terry. In that book, Maury Terry, who was a newspaper man up in New York, got onto that murder by interviewing a guy who was in jail for committing some other murders, a guy named David Berkowitz, who was arrested as the Son of Sam killer in New York City. He'd supposedly killed a bunch of people in New York for no reason. He supposedly told the press, there's an evil dog who told me to do this. Well, then when they got into interviewing him, he said, well, actually, I took the fall for this group that I'm in. It's called the Process Church of the Final Judgment. The Process, Church of the Final Judgment. And he told Moritario, by the way, this woman, Arliss Perry, was killed by people in this cult, when she interfered with what they were doing. And Charles Manson was in it too. And his whole ideology comes from this. Now, what is this thing? This is a British group that came over from England to America in the 1960s, and it's still around. Headquartered now in Canada. But this was a satanic cult. And this guy, Bruce Perry, whose wife was killed by them, is now a lecturer for the Cult Awareness Network. And he spoke at their November conference in Minnesota as an expert on what happened at Waco, Texas. The reason he knew all about that was that the FBI hired him as their expert on David Koresh, because he is an expert on on sex crimes against children.
He has experience with that, huh?
Yeah, he has a lot of experience in this field of some type. I don't say anything about what happened to him. I don't know. Was he in on his wife's murder? I don't say that. I just know that he's now protecting those who killed his wife. The interesting thing about this is that when you dig a little bit behind these organizations, you find that the Cult Awareness Network is run by the same people who run the satanic cult. The same people. There's a group of foundations and law firms in New York City that fund the Cult Awareness Network and the American Family Foundation. And the same people are the lawyers and protectors and interveners for the Process Church of the Final Judgment. Just an idea on what they say to their kids that they get involved in this. When they first came over from England, they said there were three gods: Jehovah, Lucifer, and Satan. That got to be too complicated. I guess people have a lower attention span, in later times in America, so they dropped Lucifer. He's not as interesting. So you just have Jehovah and Satan. And this is the format that's in their magazine. It's published was published on a monthly basis. That God is going to end the world, the sinful world, and Satan is going to execute the final judgment, right? And therefore, if you serve Satan, you're serving God. Hey, is there anything wrong with that? Doesn't that fit in with the end times? Who would assassinate mankind in a war? Who would deliberately cause a war that would result in the mass extermination of human beings? Satan would do that, right? You can't blame that on God. And that's your end times, right? Pretty sick, right? Pretty silly. And yet some people attribute that or say that that is fundamental to Christianity. Isn't that wild? Now, where does that really get you? What are you looking at when you look at that? We've had a really rough century. We've had a rough century. You go back to World War I, completely senseless war. World War II, massive bloodbath, unprecedented in human history, at least in Europe anyway. And then you have the threat of nuclear annihilation, the times that we're all alive. And a pretty dangerous time right now, right? With people running around murdering people in church or while they're praying, right, en masse, to try to provoke something. Let's see what this party has been doing in this. I would point your attention to a house, single house. It goes by the name of Thorpe Lodge. This is a house in England. And a gentleman named Peregrine Worsthorn grew up there. A gentleman of the highest type. I have to spell it right here. And he had a mother one time named Priscilla. I probably haven't spelled it right. She married a man who became Peregrine Worsthorn's stepfather, a guy named Montague Norman. And this was his house. So this is where Worsthorn became, a mature individual and so forth. Montague Norman is famous as being the head of the Bank of England for 24 years, from 1920 to 1944. Longer time than anyone else. Anybody else has just been head for 2 years. Before he was head of the Bank of England, he was a partner of Brown Brothers banking company. And that later merged with Harriman to become Brown Brothers Harriman. But his family firm was called Brown Brothers, and the Brown Brothers man from New York would come to Thorpe Lodge early in the century and meet with Montague Norman. They'd discuss theosophy and various occult religions. That Montague Norman was a theosophist. By the way, the reason this is quite relevant now is that Peregrine Worsthorn is like the central character in the Hollinger Corporation. Writes for the Daily Telegraph. He virtually personally launched the whole Whitewater thing against Clinton. He also was the one who declared that Germany is going into a Fourth Reich and needs to be smashed. Not Hitler's Germany, because his father put Hitler into power. Democratic Germany needs to be smashed, right? So, in the 1930s, a guy named Hjalmar Schacht used to come to Thorpe Lodge all the time. He was the economics minister of Adolf Hitler. And he'd come to Thorpe Lodge, meet with Montague Norman, Daddy, and discuss the budget of Nazi Germany. Well, how are we going to carry on for the next 6 months in Nazi Germany? Oh, great master, head of the Bank of England, who runs all world finance, and who has given the Nazi German army all of our weapons, our tanks and our machine guns, sold by British companies that you personally control, that you personally reorganized in the German marketplace until Hitler got to be sufficiently well armed that he could carry on. And of course, his family firm, Brown Brothers Harriman, Averell Harriman, George Bush's father, and other people, partners of that Anglo-American firm, paid the Nazis as they're coming up to becoming a power, the Nazi Party. So this is the pro-Hitler faction inside of England. There are people who don't appreciate Hitler in England. Montague Norman convinced the various people within the British government that they should go along with Hitler. This is the fanatically pro-Hitler faction. Not pro-German, because he figured that Germany would be weaker under Hitler than a democratic Germany, which was considered to be a threat, because they might become a strong country, a stable country, allied with other strong countries like Russia, China, Italy, etc. Then what would happen if the whole world was a bunch of strong, independent countries? Why would you need international bankers to do any particular thing? Right? Why would they have any power? Well, why am I telling you all this? Just complete on this, on the question of the mental manipulations. In the 1930s, there was a group of foundations in New York City representing Rockefeller and Harriman. One of them is called the Macy Foundation, Josiah Macy, and a few other little firms in New York. And they're the ones that now control the funding of the Cult Awareness Network and the Process Church of the Final Judgment. In those days, they were sending money over to Germany and Austria to set up psychiatric institutes to preach race purification, various forms of racial extermination, and so forth. money coming through this and from Rockefeller Foundation, all of it controlled by this guy, head of the Bank of England, who's constantly coming back and forth to New York to coordinate this stuff. Now, there's a Jewish bank involved in this, the Warburgs, who coordinated the activities of Harriman and this firm in Germany. This book, they describe, Lansky describes, because Lansky speaks in this book all the time. That's mainly quotes from Meyer Lansky, great genius of organized crime. He says that in 1935 there was a judge in New York State, a prominent man in the Republican Party, who came to him and says, Meyer, we need to fight Nazism, and you're the man to do it. We're going to give you all the money and legal help that you need, and go fight the Nazis. Pretty weird, right? The head of organized crime? And then he went out supposedly and had his thugs go and engage in fist fights with brown shirts, the German-American Bund. And they'd had fist fights that got on the news. Well, the judge was a guy named Proskauer. And Proskauer was actually in the American Jewish Committee. And that was this party that we're talking about. In other words, these are the people, they made public statements attacking my father and others who were in the boycott against Nazi Germany. This is the pro-Hitler faction of finance, including the B'nai B'rith and the American Jewish Committee. These are the people who are supposedly paying Meyer Lansky to fight Nazism. But they didn't want Jews to fight Hitler. They didn't want boycotts against Hitler or anything like that, because they're working with the whole British party that's actually putting Hitler into power. So how'd this all end up? How did somebody like Baruch Goldstein, this guy who killed all those people while they were worshiping, get to be so crazy with racial hatred that he would do something like that? It's not based on religion, because this gang didn't get religion until a certain point. They said, well, that would be useful for our faction. So they adopted this religion at a certain point. They got to be so-called conservatives or orthodox or something. They're not, most of them are former, either former communists, or they're mainly anti-Western types from Russia, like Dostoevsky. What happened is, at the end of World War II, there was a certain kind of a project to make people as crazy as possible about what had just happened in World War II. There was a final meeting at Thorpe Lodge. I remember Montague Norman was a theosophist, the principal architect of the Hitler regime, and in fact of the psychiatry that was practiced under Hitler, where they started killing people and training murderers. These were psychiatrists that were coordinated by Anglo-American people. At the end of the war, they had a meeting at Thorpe Lodge to set up what was called the World Federation for Mental Health. The most insane people that had ever walked the face of the earth, right? They set this thing up, and that's what they did there in 1948 is the basis for all mental health and psychiatric organizations today on this planet. One of the meetings they had there was a meeting on the subject of guilt and how to manipulate guilt, how to use guilt. They had a specific session on German collective guilt. And off of that, they published a book called The Authoritarian Personality. That was published by Proskauer and the American Jewish Committee. That is the pro-Nazi group in America and Britain published the literature telling you about the guilt of the German people for the crimes of Hitler. The keynote speaker at that conference on German collective guilt was Margaret Mead. And the chairman of the meeting was the head of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry's Insanity Project. Project on Insanity, run by Scottish Rite psychiatrists. He's over from America. This is a bunch of British ghouls and their American hangers-on. They had Carl Jung was a vice president of its Congress. Freud's daughter, Anna Freud, was a vice president. All the leading British people in the eugenics movement and all the leading British people dealing with building up the Soviet Union, because right after the end of World War II, they didn't have Hitler anymore, so they had to have some new dictatorship in Europe, so Europe wouldn't be republic-oriented, so they brought in communism into half of Europe. That was done by the same group of people, by Harriman, remember? Harriman was the ambassador to Russia. He arranged the Yalta meeting. And this whole little clique. So they just brought in a new type of totalitarianism. Now, what we need, instead of this party running the world or running these terrifying games in the world, is what I said at the beginning was the American approach to these things. What Perez and Arafat are working on, or were working on before this massacre, which is the concept of massive economic and industrial development in that region. Now, can you put that on the table for discussion for people? Oh, well, that's not on the agenda. We're into something else today. We're into end times, we're into environmentalism, all these different concerns, right? Not the American system of economics of the 19th century. Who ever heard of that? I'll give you a hint. Who heard of it? The Irish heard of it. There was a man named Arthur Griffith, who was the head of the Sinn Féin party, the Irish Nationalist Party, in 1920. And he died about 1922, I think, but he was actually president of Ireland for a little while. He was a real fighter. And he wrote a book about European affairs to try to educate Irish people about what's really going on in the world. And he said in this book, in our century now, he said that Henry Carey, who was Abraham Lincoln's economics teacher, created the modern American nation. And that Friedrich List, who was a friend of Carey and was involved with very obscure types, Friedrich List, a German, created modern Germany. This is this Irish leader in 1920. He also said that the British ran the French Revolution. Not the Illuminati, the British. Don't give me any Illuminati. How come the Illuminati didn't overthrow the British government if they're so interested in overthrowing governments and being communists and so forth? He said that the British Secret Service paid the Free Trade Party in every country in the world to say their nonsense about free trade. The British prohibited imports of manufactured goods into England and dumped their trash on other countries to sell it and undermine their manufacturing in every other country while preaching free trade. Until at a certain point in the middle of the last century, certain countries in Europe wouldn't buy it. And so the British had to change the law in England just enough to convince the other people that free trade was on the agenda. A lot of other things this Irish guy's writing about in our century.
His name again, please?
Arthur Griffith. You can find him in the Encyclopedia Britannica, but they won't write what he said. They'll just tell you that he existed and he was famous and president and so on and so forth. But gosh, people as long not so long ago as 1920 still knew about these things. People in America today know something about the British. For example, they know that there are people in America called Anglophiles. And they have some pretty bad attitudes about things, race attitudes or aristocratic attitudes or anti-Christian attitudes or what have you. don't necessarily put the one and the two together. They don't know today what people knew in the 19th century, or even if they see it, they don't want it to register because they say, well, how could I tell anybody else about this? So I read it and I forget about it. A simple fact that was known in the 19th century, that Adam Smith, the original of Michael Milken, who said that economics is just about getting rich. And that's all there is to it. You set up your system so that people can get rich who are able to, and that'll work out for the best. And that's all economics is about. But that in the 19th century, people knew that Adam Smith represented despotism, tyranny, reactionary politics, oligarchism, force, British Navy, bombarding ports of people and so forth, and setting cities on fire like in China and so forth. That's what was known and understood in the 19th century, and that freedom had to do with having your own powerful government. Your government. Not owned by some foreign bank or some foreign power, but owned by your people, and it has its own bank, for example, like the Bank of the United States set up by Alexander Hamilton. This kind of an idea in opposition to the British satanic